This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening. My name is Jacinta Thompson and I'm the Executive Director and Events and Exhibitions Producer of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. I would like to acknowledge that the University of South Australia meets on the land of the Kaurna people. We wish to express our respect for the Kaurna people, their elders and ancestors, and acknowledge the spiritual and cultural relationship the Kaurna people have with their traditional land. I extend that respect to Aboriginal peoples from other areas of South Australia and Australia. I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia to our panel discussion, How to be a Star Citizen in Space. This event is presented as part of Just a Thought, an exclusive in-conversation series presented by the Hawke Centre with Tori Shepherd. I would like to thank our astute panel members who will reflect on the ethical consideration space raises. So to welcome Professor Alan Duffy, Associate Professor Alice Gorman and Dr. Evie Kendall. This event is being recorded and a video will be available on the Hawke Centre website. We encourage you to bring this to the attention of friends and colleagues who could not join us online tonight. I hope you enjoy our presentation, and it is now my pleasure to introduce Tori Shepherd. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. So thank you all so much for being here for this episode of Just a Thought. Just want to start by asking you all what you're most excited about when it comes to space, because I think a general audience, a lot of people like, there's going to be a mission to Mars or, women to the moon. But then here in Australia, of course, there are also lots of, small scale things going on that are really exciting. So Evie, can I start with you? What is really grabbing your attention when it comes to space at the moment?
I think what I find most interesting about space and all the industries in space and all that we learn about a space is the way it can bring everyone together. So everyone has some interest in space. Everyone has something that they look up to the sky and see, and it's really important to them. And I think the analogies that we can draw with how we can protect our own planet, it's really easy to do that when we have other examples of other planets to draw from and things that we actually really like looking up to see. So I guess I just really love the commonality. It brings everyone on the planet together to some extent.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I remember when we had the International Astronautical Federation here, and everybody was excited and everybody had something they wanted to hear some more about. Now, Alice, Dr. Space Junk, I know what gets you going about space, but what's been grabbing your attention lately?
There's so much going on in space at the moment. So one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is the permanently shadowed regions on the moon. These are shadows in craters at the lunar poles, and the shadows are 2 billion years old. And these are also target areas for lunar mining. So I've been thinking a lot about those shadows and what shadows mean to us and the sort of cultural values of shadows in the whole solar system. And the other thing I'm really excited about at the moment is related to my current research project, which is the archaeology of the International Space Station. We're looking at what archaeological techniques can tell us about how a space society is formed in that enclosed environment. And that's kind of connected to some of the things Australia is involved in with NASA's Artemis project and the moon to Mars. So I guess I'm thinking about 2 billion-year-old shadows, and then I'm thinking about how humans will live in the future, stuck inside little tiny constrained space habitats.
Yeah, so tell us a bit more about that, because I think, first of all, you do space archaeology, which you hear it and that's really damn cool, but you got to get a little bit more into it to sort of work out what it is. And so when people think about what archaeologists look at when it comes to studying a human society, they're thinking about remnants, right? Like interpreting how various tools were maybe used or what remnants were left behind. So how are you going to start looking at the space station in that context?
it is a bit different because people are actually alive and living on it. And that's great because we can ask them, why did you do that? Or what's the purpose of this? But it's kind of the same thing. So when we're looking at stuff from the past, sites and artifacts and objects, we're using those objects to try and get an insight into what was going through people's minds. So those objects operate across all these different registers of the social, the cultural, the practical and functional. And pretty much that's what's happening on the International Space Station right now. So even though it's in the present and even though people are still using these objects, like they're in that space, we figure that we can use the same techniques to say, well, you know, what does it mean? What for me, okay, here's the other thing I'm obsessed about at the moment, Ziploc bags, just like the ones you have in your kitchen drawer. Because they're on the International Space Station. They're one of the most common objects that get sent up because they're so versatile. So just thinking about what does it mean to put that object in space? How do crew members use that very simple plastic disposable object differently? And what are its social meanings? So that's kind of what space archaeology can do.
And we are going to talk more about space archaeology later, trust me. Alan, what's cool in your world? Apart from your background, of course, which is very cool.
Yes, this galaxy I created just for this meeting.
You can tell us a bit about the galaxy, actually.
Look, it's a simulated galaxy. You basically create a universe on a supercomputer, throw in all the physics you think you understand about the universe, and critically an otherwise invisible kind of matter we call dark matter, and you let it run, and eventually you get a galaxy like the one behind me. And that is perhaps the dark matter, that mysterious extra ingredient. It's one of the biggest questions in physics today. We have a new dark matter center of excellence kicking off essentially any day now, quite literally. And that is something that I'm a part of. And it's something that unifies everything from space telescopes to direct detectors at the bottom of the Stawell gold mine in Victoria, Australia. So this answering the nature of dark matter is an all of science affair, except I think for biology. I think that's the only science that doesn't get involved. Sorry, Evie, on that one. But look, we have a lot of exciting developments in the world of space. The Australian SK Pathfinder is now fully functional. We're building or at least beginning to build the Square Kilometre Array, the largest telescope ever conceived, let alone constructed. So this is all very exciting stuff, and it really, again, showcases Australia's leadership in fundamental science, but also the incredibly advanced technologies that underpin, that facilitate those kind of questions that we dare ask in this country. And space is now just another, dare I say it, routine part of the science portfolio. We really are making this extraordinary domain very much accessible to the general public and certainly to students and universities nationwide.
Look, this may be a really dumb question, but hey, not a rocket scientist. But isn't there also something critical in dark matter in terms of whether or not there will be enough gravity to pull the whole shebang back together at some point?
Yeah, right. So there is a question about, was there enough stuff to halt the expansion of the universe, that the gravity from all those galaxies pull us back together and we get a big crunch? And it was actually the Vice Chancellor of the ANU, Brian Schmidt himself, who damned us all to a future of essentially expansion without end and an ever more dilute and ever colder, emptier universe. So we really have Professor Brian Schmidt to thank for that very cold and ominous future for us all.
But we'll forgive him because he does have the coolest Twitter handle in the universe, which I think is Cosmic Pinot, because he does space and wine. I mean, that's pretty glorious, right?
It's a good drop too, I have to say. If you can get your hands on it, it is very nice Pinot Noir. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so I mean, one of the reasons this has taken off recently is because we got a space agency in Australia, and we were laggards, right? I mean, people were saying things like, even New Zealand's got a space agency. Why doesn't Australia have one? So I might go to you first on this, Alice. What do you think it means? I mean, there was some controversy around what kind of shape it would take, how much money would go into it. But at the same time, it seems to have brought everyone together, given a sense of purpose to the space industry in Australia.
Well, the Space Agency is recently turned 2 years old, and I think that's true. I think it wasn't that we didn't do space before. So a lot of people think the Space Agency meant the beginning of Australia in space, but in fact, we have this very deep history. Australia had one of the oldest rocket launch ranges in the world in 1947, one of only 4 or 5 globally. We've had an incredible amount of space activity and space expertise, including being the third nation to launch a satellite from within our own territory, building our own sounding rockets. There's a strong expertise in space imaging and cameras developed in Australia as well. So we've had that incredible heritage, but for some bizarre reason, Australians have never sort of really owned that. We've never celebrated that in the same way as other nations. And there was actually a lot of fits and starts. We'd had space boards, we'd had different organisations that had kind of never gone anywhere. So for the space community, when you mentioned before the International Astronautical Congress in 2017, that was hosted by the Space Industry Association of Australia. And one of the outcomes we'd hoped for was that the government might finally say, look, it's time for an agency. And yeah, there was a lot of talk, like what would it look like, what would it do? And I think what we've seen at the end of 2 years, some of the things it's done, it has absolutely raised the profile of Australian space expertise, existing Australian space industries. It's enabled that government to government dialogue. We've signed memorandums of understanding with places like United Arab Emirates, who are sending a mission to Mars at the moment. And it's just provided that focal point for other nations to come to Australia to say, okay, how can we work together? And for us here and now in the industry to have something to focus on as well, to have some kind of unifying force. So I think it has been amazing for us.
Unifying force, I like it. Evie, what difference did you see once there was that agency as that focal point?
Well, when the agency started, people started talking a lot more about the space industries, etc. In Australia. That I noticed, I found there was a lot of interest in having public engagement regarding particularly space ethics, which is where I'm working. So a lot of interest in educating the public about the kind of dilemmas that we might face if we start engaging in space mining or tourism. And it had that real Australian focus. So how do we have the Australian way of life actually permeating our policy and ethics in space? So I think that was something that was really kick-started when we had our own agency and we sort of felt we had that ownership.
And Alan, now, have you just written something about the Space Agency? Did I see that pop up on the socials?
I talk about the Space Agency a fair amount, yeah. Look, I was celebrating the second birthday, I should say, of the agency, and I provided a small quote about the fact that it is this front door. It's the way for the world to access Australian industry and research expertise in space. As Alice mentioned, this is our ability to sign international treaties. It is an ability to focus the nation's attention on what we do and have done so well for so many years, but in bizarre silence almost. I mean, it really is quite extraordinary. And my experience in the last couple of years has been going from, if I do a TV interview, being asked about, do you believe in aliens or something, to being asked something more about the space agency, about rocket launches, about satellites. People are far more aware of space and the uses of space as a result of the agency. There's just something has changed the nation's understanding of the role that we play in space, that we have a presence, that we want to grow that presence. And I think that has been a real success story for the agency. There's an ambition once more in Australia for space. You could imagine, 50 years was a long time to regain that ambition. We can go back to Alice for more thoughts about that.
Yeah, Alice, did you want to add something?
Is that fair, Alice? Do you think, or am I being a little unkind?
I wanted to ask you, Alan, a bit more. Like, were aliens really the focus of people's questions to you? And do you think we've left the aliens behind now?
No, we've definitely not left the aliens. That's the second quick question that follows. But I absolutely now have questions that pertain more to careers in space, opportunities with space, be it satellites or moon, mining the moon. It's not to say that people aren't also interested in everything else about astronomy, but somehow in the last 2 years, there has been a recognition with an Australian audience that we can do more, that there's commercial activities up there, and that people are excited by that as much as they are by the aliens, which I have to say is still very much common. Yeah, that's the usual setting.
I'm glad. And also, you're down here in Adelaide, we're pretty happy as well that we'll have the Mission Control Centre as well as the Discovery Centre. And, just the idea of seeing kids going through and, maybe seeing people working on the International Space Station or seeing the launches, it's very, very exciting. But, of course, it's complicated. So we now talk about Space 2.0. And I'm going to come to you on this, Evie, first. But whereas I guess we sort of had this Cold War race that it was just the big superpowers sending people up there, but now it's nimble and it's smaller and it's faster and it's got private companies. I mean, instead of talking about a Neil Armstrong, we're talking about Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. So how does that work if we want to have good space citizens, but now it's a commercial venture, Evie?
Well, there are a number of concerns ethically and regarding policy if we're allowing a lot of private sort of interest in space. And of course, the thing that really drew people together with the space race was, of course, that idea that space belongs to all of us. It's something that we're not commercializing, and it's something that is, obviously, as we know, the province of mankind. But essentially, the idea that we're not going to use space and celestial objects for national benefit. We're going to use it for international, so global effect. Research is going to impact everyone. So the outcome of research, particularly things like medical research in space, those benefits are going to be shared equally, justly across the global community. So that was a real focus. And a lot of that is at risk of being lost if we have all these private interests coming through that are more focused on profits for companies rather than sharing the benefits of space research with the global community. So I have concerns about that, of course, but we also know that private interest will drive some of that innovation, and that will, of course, have a flow-on effect with other sort of space agencies benefiting from that knowledge and us being able to do more in space. So I think there is a balance that we have to strike. But in terms of policy and ethics, I think we definitely need to be having the conversations now that will say what private corporations are and are not allowed to do in space, so that we can protect people in a future space workforce, for example. So we do know who's going to be policing different settlements, whose interests are going to be considered most important when we have resource allocation dilemmas. All of these things are things that we can discuss on the ground right now. And I think part of the issue of having our own space agency in Australia is we're starting to realise as a community that our views actually matter, that we will be making some of these decisions and we will sort of have a vote on how this works.
I had a slightly frightening moment recently when, hearing about potential vaccines being developed for COVID, and, America kind of jumped in and went, we're going to kind of monopolise that. And now we have this conversation about sharing it, and combined with increasing nationalism around the world, I wonder how that will apply to space. Alan, what do you think about the nimbleness? Watching like these tiny little startups, it's really exciting for them, but at the same time, the overall picture starts to become kind of nebulous in terms of who's in charge of what.
Look, that's pretty accurate. We are at a very exciting moment of a race between startups, not superpowers, and this Space 2.0, or as one of Australia's perhaps best known startups in space, Fleet's founder Flavia Tatarandini would say, Space 4.0. I personally don't know where the other numbers went there, but anyways, we have a very confusing but exciting ecosystem where there is a to date, very healthy connection between national agencies, defense, and a growing ecosystem of startups and SMEs. And really at this stage, Australia has a very early ecosystem. There are very exciting, nimble startups. There's some very established primes and very large organizations, and not much in between. And that's perhaps what the agency is really most excited about growing, taking those smaller startups and growing them up. But from my point of view, the lack of clarity on the regulations, Evie mentioned, that policy work has to be done now. It's not appropriate to wait until a disaster or a situation has arisen that drives that policy. We don't want to be doing this in a hurry. We also want to be able to control these industries before they get too large. Space is a phenomenally valuable domain, and if lunar resource mining, or indeed going on beyond to the asteroids, words like trillion-dollar assets are thrown about. I mean, when anything's $1 trillion, you're not controlling it. It's escaped your opportunity to regulate by that point. So this is one area that I am excited by, Australia's legacy of tight regulation of mining, albeit not without some horrendous failures. Let's be quite honest about that, especially in recent months. But that legacy of regulation is something I would hope to see extended into space. And this is why I'm excited to see some of the larger mining interests now beginning to look quite seriously about the space domain. The expectation would be they just take that heritage of a regulated approach with them into space, that as opposed to a startup must break the rules, ask for forgiveness, not permission, all of the VC or Silicon Valley mantras that come to mind at that point. That anyone in a hurry in space is going to make a mistake, and mistakes can be deadly in that harsh environment. So we really want to ensure the larger, better regulated entities are setting the stage, and the startups and a healthy ecosystem that works alongside that, that would be the ideal. And until we get clarification, until we get, quite frankly, the giggle factor removed from politicians, where the talk of space mining and they think they can't raise it with their electorate because they'll just be laughed out of the town hall meeting. We have to get over that giggle factor and have these people take these kinds of regulations seriously, because, well, as Evie mentioned, if we don't do it now, it will be soon too late.
And I think some people might be a little bit cynical about big mining operations setting up anywhere near an ancient alien civilization right now.
I think that's a throw to Alice.
Yeah, let's go to Alice on this one. And can we segue back to your $2 billion holes, for example? I mean, Australia has this real expertise in remote mining, right, because of the nature of Australia and our resources. What might be in those holes, and what sort of ethics and issues do you think we have to go through before before people start getting up there and, I don't know, flag in the sand?
Well, I think Alan was spot on mentioning our regulation of mining industry in Australia and how it operates. So that's literally the field I used to work in. I was a heritage consultant working with Indigenous heritage, often as part of environmental impact studies. And I think there's some really interesting issues here. The first thing is that the concept of environment for space is really poorly developed. And that's often because we think of it on Earth as something that's an ecosystem. There are things that are living, and the absence of things that are living, as far as we know at this point in time, means people say, oh, well, we don't have to worry about that. There literally is no environment. And that is not the case. So we need to have an environmental management framework for space. And obviously I'm particularly interested in the heritage aspects of this. If we look at the moon, there are 60 locations where human missions have landed in the last 60 years. So it's quite a rich cultural landscape. And it's kind of easy to sort of, Apollo 11, first place where humans set foot on the world. So it's quite easy to see the significance of that. But if we look at those 2 million year old shadows in those craters at the lunar poles, so there's a little mission that's being launched in the next year or so that's going to shine a light onto the surface of those shadows, a light where no light has been for 2 billion years. So what does that mean? What are the aesthetic values of those permanently shadowed regions? There's only 2 other locations in the solar system where shadows that old, Mercury and Ceres. And Alan, tell me if I'm wrong about this. Ceres is a planetoid in the asteroid belt. So there's so much to think about, I think. So it's not up to, maybe humans find it difficult to relate to the 2 billion year old shadow at the moon, but for whom else or what else is it important? Like, what are we doing if we destroy that? What will it be like if we turn around 50 years from now and just say, you know, what were they doing out there? Like, what were they thinking about? And there's a big dialogue at the moment with people saying, you know, we have to be careful. We can't over-regulate space because we'll discourage all these people. And I just think bull to that. Regulation has never deterred a mining operation on Earth, as we see daily evidence of. And I think we have all these big questions about the value, the intrinsic value of the broader solar system environment. And as Evie said, like, we have to decide what is our approach to this stuff. We can't decide later. We have to decide this now. And I think Australia has a real role to play in showing leadership on this thinking and this philosophy.
So look, I want to come back a little bit later to things like, you know, what if we do pollute Mars and space tourism? What are the ethics of that? But just before we go any further, with the privatisation and the space 2.0, I mean, that's also where we start to get to the congestion of space. And so, Alice, I might just stick with you for a sec, because I think one of the most interesting things I've ever heard is you talking about some of the things that are just floating around up there. I mean, when we talk about space junk, most people, I mean, there might be flecks of paint and there might be, you know, there's obviously some disused spacecraft and so, but tell us some more about, I guess, the cultural artifacts in space.
Yeah, well, when you say that word junk, like, you assume it's stuff that has no use or is of no interest or value to anyone. But some of my favourite things up there are technically classed as junk. And one of my all-time favourites is a little Australian satellite called Australis Oscar 5 that was designed and built by a bunch of uni students from Melbourne Uni and their mates on an absolute shoestring budget. And it nearly launched before Australia's first satellite, Resat-1. Just imagine if an amateur satellite had beat the government satellite into orbit. Launched in 1970, so it was 50 in 2020. Still up there, a piece of space junk. But as a cultural artefact, it's such an Australian story. It's, you know, the people with so few resources, just ingenuity in their minds, creating a satellite that worked, and it had volunteers across the world track it and send data in. So it wasn't just this little group, but like it engaged this huge community. And it's still up there. It's a piece of space junk, but it's Australian space heritage. And it's kind of the precursor of all of these little nimble satellite industries we're talking about now, the CubeSats and nanosats, things that can be built quickly, launched quickly, give us data quickly. This is their ancestor. So if somebody's going to say, right, we need to zap a laser at some of this stuff, and I'm sure we'll get onto this.
Definitely lasers.
If someone said, you know, it's junk, it's a hazard, let's get rid of it, I would say, well, let's first assess whether it is actually a hazard or not before we get rid of it, because being in space is part of what makes this little old satellite special.
I remember also you told me once about a whole range of poetry that's floating around up there, which I thought was delightful. Evie, ethically, all this stuff is going up there. congesting orbits. How complicated is that, again, when we're talking about regulation and commercial interests as well as state powers?
Yeah, well, we need really, really strict sort of regulation for what goes up there, but also, really importantly, who's responsible for it once it's up there? Who's responsible for removing it if it's being decommissioned? So again, we have a lot of clutter up there that is impacting other people's projects. Obviously, it's impacting us down here. And it's a little unclear who's responsible for actually cleaning up the space junk. And I think it's another way we can look at, okay, this is a problem in space, but it's very much a problem down here too. Who's responsible for cleaning up our planet? Who's responsible for the amount of damage that corporations have done? So every person might try and help, but really the big corporations are the ones who have done a lot of damage. So I think it really is an opportunity to think about responsibility for environmental damage, responsibility for waste and the sort of cleanup of waste. And I think space does provide us that really good opportunity to think about how we conduct ourselves on Earth as well. So I think that the space junk issue is a very rich ethical issue, and it is something that we can change moving forward. We can make it more obvious who's responsible for this, what we are going to allow people to put in space, leave in space, remove from space.
And handle this if it's not your area, but we're starting to do a bit of that, aren't we? Like, as people are applying for licenses, it comes along with the obligation of return, but we've also seen corporations down here with much more regulation have, snuck stuff into rivers and so on.
Yes, they have. And that's often an analogy that I draw when I'm teaching about the topic, because we often don't have very strict regulation about what people can dump in different places. And if they know the right loophole, they can get away with quite a lot, as we've seen historically. But also things like new technologies aren't necessarily legislated about before they've been released. So we'll have things like geoengineering projects that haven't actually been legislated one way or the other as to what you are or are not allowed to do if you're trying to combat something like climate change. So we have the same kind of problem with what are we allowed to do in space. If the technology hasn't even been conceived of yet, then the legal and ethical framework for how it's developed, used, etc., hasn't been developed either. So part of that is just being anticipatory in our ethics, looking at, okay, what have we had in the past that we didn't manage to regulate or protect against effectively, and how can we sort of predict what might come in the next few iterations, particularly in the space industry, so that we can start thinking, okay, what kind of society do we want in space? What kind of regulation do we want about, startups and what they're allowed to do, large corporations, what they're allowed to do when it comes to, development, and of course, what they've actually put in space and what we're going to do with it now that it's there.
And I was thinking, we're going to get to lasers in a second, Alice, sorry. I was also thinking, congestion in space, if you get enough debris smashing into each other and you get the Kessler syndrome and you can end up with this cascading effect, it's not dissimilar to what we see when you see things like bee colony collapses or the way that an ecological event on Earth caused by a corporation can then also cascade through the ecosystem. Can you talk us through what it might look like if the congestion in orbit starts to get out of control?
In terms of the ethical ramifications?
Yeah, well, both, all the physical. I guess maybe, let's go to Alice. Alice, if stuff starts smashing into itself in orbit, what does that look like and what's the potential outcome?
People might have seen some representations of what it looks like. The movie Gravity, which had a very, very graphic fatality from collision with space junk. And another film I like for this is WALL-E, about the little robot who goes to space. So you might remember he has to punch his way out of a very thick layer of space junk around the Earth. So they were representations of very dense space junk. But the key thing here is that it's moving at incredibly high speed. So it's sort of an average of 7 or 8 kilometres a second in low Earth orbit. And collision with stuff at that speed, depending on the size, creates more bits. And those bits range from, a few kilos, sometimes larger, right down to the tiny, tiny micro particles. And anything in space is constantly bombarded by those microparticles. So this means we increasingly have to design spacecraft to resist that kind of effect. One that didn't exist before 1957 when Sputnik 1 got up there. So people will also probably have seen maps where there are lots of little white dots around the Earth representing junk. One of the things about space is that this stuff is actually very far apart. Stuff isn't all crowded in together like we see in those pictures. It is actually quite some distance apart. But the Kessler syndrome scenario isn't, you know, just a little tiny rain of those nanoparticles hitting objects and every now and then something that's, you know, the size of a cane toad colliding with something. It's that those collisions would be constant. Every collision would create more pieces that would ricochet off and collide with more pieces and more pieces and more pieces. And that's the scenario that people are very keen to avoid, because that in order to successfully have a spacecraft operate, it would be way more expensive. It would have to be incredibly well shielded. We would have to use orbits that are not optimal. So we'd be forced to totally redesign our space industry if indeed it was possible to continue it in the way we have been at this point in time. And when some people say, look, that's never going to happen. Kessler, after whom the syndrome is named, who collaborated with this other space scientist, Burton Court-Pillay, their original question was, why won't space junk form rings like Saturn and Neptune and the other planets have? Why are we not going to get rings? Why will it become this cloud around the Earth? So, in fact, Alan can tell me if this is right or not. They said there wouldn't be enough weight or mass in the space junk to actually create a ring. And what would then happen is that not everywhere necessarily, but high density regions would become unusable. We just couldn't launch things into those high density regions anymore. So this is what we're staring down the barrel of at the moment if this stuff is not regulated.
Alan, take it away. I mean, what is, okay, spacecraft bumping into each other, people might not realise that means satellites, that means navigation, GPS, communication. What does it look like if Kessler syndrome rolls out?
So it is a nightmare. It's also a mathematical inevitability if we don't actively start to reduce the amount of material that's up there. The increased number of pieces because they're colliding because of military strikes on communication satellites, China in 2007, Russia 2009. These created thousands of pieces of debris. And again, just to emphasize the challenge here, as Alice mentioned, this material is moving at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour. It means a screw has about the energetics of a hand grenade when it hits a satellite, right? So this is going to take out satellites. It creates more junk, and then in turn that creates others. This will be impossible to shield against in certain regions, or at least it would increase the weight of shielding to such an extent that we just don't get to use low Earth orbit. It won't affect GPS directly. Those are vastly more distant orbits. And in fact, it's worth bearing in mind that the reason we don't have a problem in GEO, not just because it's so much larger as a volume for satellites to orbit in, is because the value of those orbits was recognized very early on in the space era, and it meant that there was a one-in, one-out system, essentially. You had to actively move your satellite out of its orbit to allow a new operator to take that slot. What we don't have is a similar principle in LEO. There was a sense of an industry...
Do you want to just spell out the acronyms there for us, Alan?
I'm doing the jargon.
Sorry.
Sorry, all. GEO is geosynchronous Earth orbit. In other words, it keeps track with the rotation of the Earth. So from the point of view of the person on Earth looking up, that satellite is fixed in the sky. Very convenient for relaying TV signals, essentially, bouncing back satellite TV. LEO is low Earth orbit. That's a relatively fluid boundary, but essentially it takes about 90 minutes to go around the Earth. It's where everything we know and love is. It's where the Hubble Space Telescope is, the International Space Station. It's also very energetically accessible, and it's why there is now so much material up there. CubeSats, nanosats, all of these new space entrepreneurs are out there. I'm gonna pause because Alice has very politely put her hand up.
Alice has an excited hand up. Go on.
Yeah.
Just picking up on something Alan said just now. So we have this idea that space is very far away, and it's hard to get to, but in a sense it isn't far away. Like low Earth orbit, the International Space Station is 400 kilometres above us. So that's like, okay, I don't drive, so I'm not very good at distances, but 400 kilometres, that's like driving from Adelaide to somewhere.
Woomera? That's a guess. I'm hopeless too.
So in terms of sort of imagining that distance, that's really not very far.
Yeah, technically, just to get into space, it's about an hour. If you could drive at highway speeds going vertically up, not too bad. I
kind of want to still stick on that congestion thing for a little bit. Evie, so we talked about the responsibility for putting things up there. What about bringing them back down?
Also, can you bring them back down in some cases? In terms of the congestion, when I was looking up the Kessler syndrome, at first I obviously, because mostly I do medical science and medical ethics, I was like, oh, I wonder if that's a disease that astronauts get, because that's what it sounds like. And then I was like, no, it's a disease that we're giving space. And anything in medicine, if you know anything we talk about with medical experimentation, if you hear the word cascade, you are in trouble. So some of our largest ethical dilemmas in medical research, where we've done trials and given people experimental drugs, they've had cascade events and they're absolutely catastrophic. So it was a good sort of analogy to think about. All this congestion, we did that as a species, we did that. So we are very responsible for it. And I think it's not just in terms of what are we using space for and what is the impact if we lose our satellites, but it's also thinking about, and I'm referring to that we as Australian there, it's also looking at if we knock out some of these satellites, what kind of impact is that going to have on people in, say, the developing world? What kind of impact is that going to have more globally? So it's not just about the responsibility for the people who put satellite up there or the people who have contributed to this congestion. We're also looking at long-term effects for other countries that are developing, that are actually using the technologies and the benefits of what we have out in space, and how we can make sure that we avoid some of these issues, that we keep our satellites functioning, because they are actually generating a lot of benefit to help other countries obviously developing as well. So it's not just that we're using the technology in our everyday lives to make it easier. They're not just benefits, sort of luxuries. There are things that a lot of people are really relying on. So making sure that we do everything we can to mitigate the effects of this sort of congestion in space, trying to clear it up so we can maintain some of the benefits that we are actually receiving from what we have up there at the moment. So removing things, being really cautious about what we're putting up there, and obviously respecting other countries' materials up in space as well. So again, we've already heard that sometimes it is used, we do actually attack satellites from other countries. That has happened. So just thinking about what is the sort of the long-term ramifications for the everyday citizen when something like that happens. Very much an ethical issue that we need to be thinking about moving forward.
It's with 2 points, because one is I want to get to the lasers and how we start to bring things back down. But, some things do sort of eventually deorbit and they mostly burn up harmlessly. Sometimes they don't. And I think one of the first times I came across your work was potentially a Chinese, Japanese satellite that was deorbiting and was going to land on Earth. And nobody knew what was going to be in it. People were like, what if it's full of nuclear radiation or microbes? So at the moment, we don't have any control over where things like that land, but we can have a conversation about what might be in it.
Oh, those are two very good questions. And recently, in this era of COVID-19, I went back to watch the classic zombie apocalypse film, Night of the Living Dead. And the cause of people turning into zombies in that film, which is 1954 or 5, I think, was radiation, deadly radiation that came from a Venus probe that, you know, irradiated and infected people on Earth. So this is sort of something we're seeing kind of conspiracy theories arise around at the moment too. So to come back to the first part of your question, there are two kinds of re-entry. One is controlled, where objects are deliberately deorbited over an area of ocean or land where they'll cause the minimum damage to anyone. And there is, in fact, a point in the ocean called Point Nemo, which is kind of the furthest point from land in any direction. So a lot of stuff gets deorbited there. But then, of course, there are the uncontrolled ones. Skylab in 1979 was a good example of that. Cosmos 945 in 1978 actually released nuclear fuel over northern Canada in the land of country of a number of indigenous nations. And some of the recent re-entries, like the Chinese and Russian ones that we've seen, have had toxic fuel. So hydrazine is a very widely used rocket fuel, not so great for living things, for humans or ecosystems. And there's also materials like beryllium that are widely used, which are metals which are actually toxic if you touch them. So generally what happens is stuff is consumed in that re-entry process. It's only the most robust parts of spacecraft, which are often titanium pressure vessels, which people can find years later. They're called space balls. So they're literally something the size of a basketball or bigger, that's part of the spacecraft fuel system. So they're pretty harmless. But you know, there's a reason to be concerned about what kinds of contaminants are returned, particularly from some of the larger spacecraft with large, very well shielded and very robust fuel tanks. So yeah, there are definitely questions that should be asked about the effects of contamination from a much increased rate of re-entry. The more stuff we put up there, the more rocket bodies there are, the more fuel that's used, the more stuff that might make it back down. So looking at an accelerated rate of launch means that we also have to think more carefully about what those environmental impacts are.
So then let's get to lasers, Alan. I mean, okay, I keep hearing about all these different ways you might be able to, you know, get rid of some space junk. So I've heard of kind of like magnets, and maybe you can like cast a net and reel some in, or you can break them up with, talk me, because I have this problem where I read science fiction and sometimes conflate it with actual science. So talk us through what the possibilities are in terms of getting rid of space junk.
Good thing. So they all operate on the same principle, right? It's, if you slow it down, its altitude will decrease. It will become closer to the Earth's atmosphere, experience more drag from the atmosphere, slow further down, and then eventually burn up as it reaches that denser parts of the upper atmosphere. So now the key is, how do you slow it down? If there's a single large piece, then you go very old school indeed, and you fire a harpoon into it, or you try to throw a net around it. And now the principle is, you're holding onto it, let's try to drag it back. So you have some sort of retro thruster action, essentially a rocket facing the other way, attached to your net or harpoon, and it's trying to fire itself in the opposite direction, slowing down the object, and off they burn up. Alternatively, you might deploy some kind of a sail, whatever it is that will slow down the object. Now that's in the nice scenario that you have a well modeled orbit of a very large single piece of junk. Actually, I should have said before you even get to that point, you retain enough fuel in a still functioning satellite that you intentionally control its deorbit, right? So that is the first option. That does not happen anywhere near enough, quite frankly. It's very suspicious how many of these satellites just tend to run out of fuel unexpectedly before they can be intentionally parked in a higher orbit or deorbited. Now, anyways, let's go back to the fun, right? So the fun is, you go up, you harpoon these things, or you throw a net around them. Alternatively, if the pieces are breaking up It's just not economically viable to grab these individual pieces. You can begin to get a bit more sci-fi, and then we're trying to essentially fire lasers at the smaller pieces, and these are about centimeter sized, give or take. And at that point, and in fact this is work that Australia is leading, we fire lasers into the sky initially to actually improve our ability to see the space junk. The best thing you can do with space junk is to get out of its way. The second best and more costly option is to go up and try and clean it. So if we fire a laser up into the sky, a technique called adaptive optics, essentially we, to the point of view of the telescope back on Earth, looking up at that laser point, it's completely blurred, it's shaking all over the place because of the shimmering of the atmosphere, the air, which is always in motion. And we've, especially in Adelaide, you will have been very familiar with the shimmering of air above hot tarmac, for example, on a hot summer's day. That kind of effect is always happening, and that blurs the picture of this space junk. If you fire that laser up, you can correct for the effects of the Earth's atmosphere by changing the mirror hundreds, if not thousands of times a second, tiny deformations that turn that little blurred laser into the precise dot that it should be, and hence anything behind it will also be now seen much more clearly. So that's where you can use lasers in the first instance, and that's what is happening right now in Canberra with the ANU. The second stage is, of course, well, now you happen to have a laser and can track the junk, and why not just power up that laser a bit more and hit the junk and try to slow it down? And there you use the pressure of light itself. Light has a force behind it. You can actually begin to slow down the smaller pieces. It's not been proven. I think I'm right in saying we're still on the drawing board on that one. We're very excited about that as a potential, and I would certainly put my hand up to control the joystick, X-wing sort of Luke Skywalker style to shoot that stuff down. But at this stage, it's very much in principle. Our first and most likely, realistically, major use of the lasers is just to see the space junk better.
And maybe just quickly, does anyone want to put their hand up for light pollution? And I guess Elon Musk populating the sky with bright, shiny things. I mean, I was thinking, it's almost, go Alice, it's almost the same as what we were talking about before. Like, rich dude owns private company, does things that annoys many other people. So you go.
Well, I know Ellen is going to have a lot to say about this as well. But the thing for me that's really startling is that how quickly those Starlink satellites, so I can't remember how many have been launched so far. I did a calculation.
There was 60 in a job lot that I think was the one that really got to the astronomers.
30,000. I doubt we'll get 30,000, but you never know. It's how quickly it's changing people's perceptions of the night sky. So in the early days, there were more people annoyed by the impacts on astronomy, optical astronomy, maybe more, than they were pleased about it. But in a very short space of time, these satellites, which are much more visible at the moment than your regular satellite, because they are in low Earth orbit as well, people are getting excited about this. People are going outside specifically to look for these satellites. So they're changing culturally what we see in the night sky. And the thing that I started to think about one day, so some of my research was thinking about what it felt like for people in 1957 when Sputnik 1 was launched. Like, how did you respond to the idea that there was this little artificial bird in the sky? And I worked out how many of those early satellites overlapped. But then there were 2 in the sky at the same time, then there were 3 in the sky at the same time, then 1 re-entered and there were 2 again. So just thinking about the fact that now we have thousands and thousands and thousands more, there is going to come a time, probably in the next generation or so, where all the people who remember the pre-space age sky, the pre-Sputnik 1 sky, will have died. There will be no one alive who remembers what the night sky was like when it didn't have human stuff in it, let alone the number of things we're going to get from these low Earth telecommunications constellations. So the impacts on the longer term human relationship to the night sky is something that just blows me away at the moment.
Evie, can I go to you on that? Because I was thinking, you know, people, the sky has a metaphysical import for people, you know. There are myths and fables built around where the stars sit. There are, obviously, there are indigenous beliefs about various constellations. So talk us through, I guess, the ethics of people just disrupting that socially.
Well, again, it's one of those really interesting examples of why space is special. Like, we already feel quite uncomfortable about the idea of not being able to see constellations. And again, like you've mentioned, that there are Indigenous stories that are really focused on particular constellations. And we have this, as you say, metaphysical sort of relationship. There's so much poetry about the moon and stars, etc. And we are very uncomfortable with changing the view of the night sky. But then if I say I need to chop down every second tree so that you can have electricity, people are like, oh, that's okay. That's okay. And we're changing our landscape all the time. And just sort of tying back to the biosecurity issue that Alice was talking about, we have this romanticized view of any potential life in space. So if I said, I discovered a bacterium in space, should I protect its life? People are like, yes, yes, yes. Should I protect the life of COVID-19? No, 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 definitely not. And what if I have a special mutated version of COVID-19 that happened to occur on the space station? Is it special because it's in space, or is it subject to the same sort of treatment that we'd give it here? So I think it's another really interesting way of looking at, okay, what are we already doing on this planet that's affecting, you know, light pollution, congestion, waste, etc. And why is it that putting that in space suddenly has that more sort of importance to us? So we're looking at it as this is a great tragedy. We're losing this poetry, this art, whereas we're also losing that here every day. So again, something that draws us together but really makes us think about our everyday existence on Earth as well.
Yeah, maybe because we can all kind of see the same thing when it comes to space, but not our own backyard. And Alan, there's a scientific impact, isn't there? I was reading that some astronomers are really struggling with the impact on some of their observations.
It's absolutely right. The Starlink constellation, the ethical dilemma we face is that it potentially can provide internet to developing nations and offer incredible benefits. But at what cost? And at this stage, the main loser appears to be astronomy that sits in the so-called time domain, or in other words, the changing sky. So we look at seconds and take rapid sequences of pictures, and we're looking for exploding stars or, well, in fact, many things that have now surprised us. We've only recently discovered in that cadence of just seconds or even milliseconds, things change and potentially reveal entirely new phenomena. On a very much more self-interested point of view, we should not want to blind the optical telescopes, look for changes in the night sky, very subtle changes over the course of nights, because that's exactly what asteroids look like. And in particular, when they're on a collision with Earth, it is really important that we find these things as early as possible. Starlink will get in the way of that. We have facilities like the Large-Scale Synoptic Telescope, LSST, which is designed to take thousands of pictures of the night sky, incredible detail, look for changes, and something that flashes overhead in trains or even predictable or not orbits, that just makes it all the harder. It blinds us to so much of the sky. It's actually, there is a way to get around this. We can just blank out those patches. We hope there's not an asteroid hiding behind that blank strip, but anyways, you can get around it. Far more damaging is in fact the era of radio, and then in particular, we're looking at what is called sub-millimeter bands, because these Starlinks are broadcasting internet signals. That's their function. They want to cover the entire planet in a very loud, very bright, very powerful, and useful for internet radio signal. And we are spending hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer money on a new generation of those kinds of telescopes that will now be blinded. And the only way around that, quite literally, is to go to the far side of the moon. So I put a tweet out to Elon Musk, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, as in I didn't expect him to answer, but I'm very serious to take up the offer, to use this incredible wealth that will be generated and industrial platform of launching Starlink to also launch a radio telescope to place on the far side of the moon, where it will be protected from all of this radio frequency interference, or RFI, that he is actually generating. Again, there is a dilemma that you face, that this is a balance between the progress, the potential economic and societal benefits that come from global internet coverage, and the costs. And at one point, someone has to ask, we will lose our night sky, or at least it has been changed. Did we all get a say on that? And that's no, is the short answer. And as our ability in space continues to grow, this kind of question will keep coming up.
Now I'm going to go to you, Alice, but just have to check. Did Elon get back to you?
There was no Elon reply. There was some Musk bros though. But anyway, so we'll leave that aside.
And Alice, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think we've too quickly accepted the narrative that this global internet access is the only way to provide internet access to these nations, because we still rely on a terrestrial infrastructure. And in fact, we must keep terrestrial infrastructure going as redundancy, resilience. If something takes out all those satellites and we have no terrestrial telecommunications infrastructure left, then we're screwed. So a lot of the issue here is that there has been no investment in local infrastructure in some parts of the world. So the solution isn't necessarily a whole 30,000 LEO satellites to provide this. There are many other ways for these services to be provided, but this has become the sort of dominant story, and I think that's slightly concerning. And there's a thing that, used to be called the digital divide, and it was about, even though you have access to internet, it doesn't mean everybody gets to use it. And globally, the digital divide is strongly divided on gender lines. So, and we also know, we also know that these technologies are used for the stalking and terrorisation of women. So in places where there is a domestic violence, it doesn't mean everybody gets internet access. What it means is that those who already have power get more power. So were these things that were considered by SpaceX and Elon Musk when they started applying for licenses, which they have done in Australia? They're applying for a license in Australia so that we will get these services as well. And I could be wrong. I'm happy to be proven wrong. But I rather suspect these were not considerations when the whole story of global internet access was being put forward.
I rather suspect that you're right. And so I just want to pick up on that idea of what if somebody takes out all those satellites? I mean, we do have some subterranean cables, but I also know that, for example, the Defence Force, like guys on these frigates out at sea, they're having to practice steering by the stars just in case the satellites come down, in case there's some kind of space warfare, in case somebody takes down all their communication system. And it just struck me that, yeah, but what if the stars are harder to see as well? But that's probably just a way to get into, I guess, the militarisation of space. Evie, I'm going to come back to you. I mean, we know that China is expanding its presence in space, and that a lot of that, there has been a lot of, I guess, belligerent talk about expanding its power within space. We've seen Iran recently put up a satellite. How are we going to govern interactions in space when we see a defiance of the rules-based order on Earth? It's again the same thing, isn't it? Reflecting what's happening here is also happening in space, only it's much less visible.
Yeah. And it's a lot more difficult to regulate. You can have all the safety standards in the world, but it's going to be very difficult to actually send a regulator up there to check that everyone's compliant. And I think one of the major issues, and this is one of the areas that I'm researching right now, is essentially if we were to establish, say, settlements, like human settlements on other planets, who's actually going to police them? So are we going to have a private military for each one? Are we going to have conflicting national military posts on each planet? So you can have your own embassy. If you happen to be a Chinese citizen on the moon, you'll go to that police force or embassy or whatever. And again, these are issues that we actually really do need to seriously consider. So we can't just start putting people in, say, a lunar settlement and hope for the best, because we will have things like, future criminal activity. We will have breaches of occupational health and safety standards if we are engaging in things like mining. And we do need ways to actually follow up on that and protect the rights and interests of anyone who's actually in that space workforce, so to speak. So I think our real issue is not so much what's happening right now, although that is concerning. We really need to be forward-looking. Like, what is the extreme possibility here if we start having conflict in space? And tying back to something that Alan was saying about impact trajectories, impact hazards, we already have a lot of nations trying to develop technology to, say, shoot down asteroids that might be on an impact trajectory with their part of the planet. But the concern is, of course, we have what we call dual-use dilemmas. They could also be used for terrestrial warfare, particularly things like nuclear explosive devices to deal with, say, an asteroid. There's nothing that would stop someone necessarily saying, I'm only stockpiling these just in case there's an asteroid. So it's only for planetary defense. Whereas we know that the nuclear proliferation has led to a lot of suffering. It's a very political issue. So anything that we're doing in space has ramifications here politically, culturally, and obviously ethically and legally as well. So I guess the answer to your question is, how do we regulate this? Very, very carefully, very thoughtfully, and very much in advance of having, these settlements, having these workforces, having these private industries and national outposts, etc., up in space.
Well, Ellen, I'll go to you. So we do have like the Outer Space Treaty, right? But I think that basically says, don't take any weapons of mass destruction up there. So obviously something a little more nuance is needed. And I know there's work going on at the moment. So it's happening here in Adelaide on the Woomera manual. You talk to people about who are looking at, I guess, how you regulate war, which itself seems like a crazy thing to say, but things like what constitutes an act of war in orbit. If China or Russia sort of bump one of their satellites up too close to ours, or seem to be monitoring it or interfering with it. Is that something that people are talking about how the disruption here on Earth could spread to space?
Look, absolutely. The disruption is already occurring. There is essentially a very lukewarm war, I would imagine, going on every day. And it's worth bearing in mind that the ownership of an object in space is unending in some level. In other words, that's actually the challenge of cleaning up space junk. That satellite is still owned by that nation. You mess with it, that is effectively an act of war, potentially. Now it's broken up into 10 pieces. You try to take out those 10 pieces. You still try to shoot down someone's satellite, right? So that's the challenge of space junk. It's also the challenge of regulating militarization of space. It is, of course, occurring. It's a force multiplier. It makes your armies, your defense forces more effective to use space. It is becoming ever more obviously a contested region or regime. And I don't see any of that ending or changing soon in any material way. If anything, it'll just become more so. But you don't necessarily have to shoot down someone's satellite to take it out. You have either direct interference, where essentially a smaller satellite creeps up on the large valuable defense satellite and in some way interferes with it directly. Very much a James Bond-esque solution to taking out someone's satellite. Far more easily, you just hack it, right? You compromise the satellite, you feed it false information, no one even knows you're there. These are far more likely outcomes. And as we move to having, as Alice mentioned, the number of some 30,000 Starlink satellites potentially up in space, that's just 30,000 more vulnerable points. And this new era of space 2.0, or space 4.0, the military is looking at that as a key manner in which to deploy its intelligence assets, to use civilian infrastructure to get the intelligence it needs to relay communications, take high-resolution imagery and indeed video of interests of, locations of interest. Now, all of that means that space has always been dual use, dual purpose. We've always been able to very easily turn the rocket that carried the astronauts to an intercontinental ballistic missile, or in other words, in fact, the other way around, right? We took the nuke deploying rockets and put people on them, or satellites in the first instance. So this new era just blurs it in the other direction. Defense now uses commercial operators. In other words, no one's assets are safe if a war between significant adversaries kicked off on Earth. Immediately, you would have to go for the space assets. And because all the defense agencies are using these civilian commercial operators, you would have to take out theirs as well. Now, again, it doesn't necessarily have to be direct strikes in the way that China demonstrated in 2007, taking out one of its own satellites just to show it could. But it absolutely will still deny that opportunity to an adversary through hacking, or just through causing a large debris cloud to take out a specific orbit and protect yourself that way, and just fire shrapnel essentially up there. I mean, there are many these kinetic means of taking out adversaries. These don't end with the conflict. We essentially then have that legacy for centuries before all of that junk deorbits. And again, we bring on the Kessler syndrome in essentially in a manner of days, and last with that for centuries. It's a very scary and fraught future that we are faced with, and there is not enough work being done on diminishing the likelihood of that occurring. In fact, sadly, very much the opposite.
Alice, do you think, I mean, we saw United States President Donald Trump unveil the Space Force, which unfortunately had an insignia that looked rather like Star Trek. Do you think Australia needs to muscle up in space? Do you think that's something that the Defence Force should be? Actually, they have promised more funding, but it's more in terms of the communications and the navigation. Do you think that we need to have a more militaristic presence, or maybe more spies?
Well, Australia has always fairly heavily invested in defence space assets and capabilities, so I don't think that's going to change. But I think, I would really hate to see, I mean, the scenario Ellen has described is pretty grim, and things like this could hasten the onset of the Kessler syndrome, like a few years from now. So there are consequences for everyone. I think Australia should be attempting to, play a role in demilitarisation and de-weaponisation. There's actually a difference between the two. So we have, space is already militarised, but it isn't currently weaponised to any great degree. I mean, there are some there. I mean, I think we should be actively working to demilitarise, de-weaponise, de-escalate. Because a lot of this stuff, it's a national prestige issue. A lot of military stuff is simply all about that. And if you analyse political dialogue around these things, then you can see there is a lot of political leaders do not wish to be seen as feminised by caring about peace. It literally is as simple as that. So this isn't stuff we want to see happen or want to see escalate on the terrestrial world we live on now any more than it is. We certainly don't want to take it into orbit and onto other celestial bodies. So I would say Australia doesn't need a space force. In fact, the more effective thing to do would be to reinvest in what we used to have, which was an asteroid defence organisation that was looking out that was actively participating in keeping us safe from unknown asteroid strikes, as Alan was talking about earlier. I think that would be far more effective. So personally, I do not want to see a space force in Australia.
Is it NASA that defunded the near-Earth object?
No, I think it was a contribute. Well, there's a bit of a tortured history behind it, but no. But Australia had a very significant bit of the solar system to monitor. It cost basically one person's salary. We chose not to continue.
Okay. So end of universe, life, world as we know it. We are getting to the end of our chat. So I thought, you know what, I'm just going to end on something that may be a little bit flippant, a little bit lighthearted, and just go to each of you. So look, Alan, I'm going to start with you because I know you've thought about it. Intelligent life out there?
Look, some days I'm not sure there's intelligent life down here, but yeah, I think the chances are there is life beyond Earth, 4 billion Earth-like twins in our galaxy alone. Whether it's intelligent or not, I really can't say. The chances are probably that there has been. In fact, a colleague of mine, Chris Consolis, just put out a paper that estimated it was somewhere between a couple to a couple dozen in the lifetime of our galaxy, and indeed even currently right now. So yeah, it seems likely. I would say, and I want to just be a little bit controversial on this point, we were going to talk about, I think, about protecting environments and going out there and stopping contamination by Earth-born organisms. I'm actually a big fan of life. I think biology is fantastically exciting, and physics is great, but it obeys the rules of physics, whereas life invents its own rules, creates its own structures, and that, of course, is evolution. I would be a fan of having a very serious discussion about colonizing other places within our solar system, spreading life in case the intelligent life on this planet somehow takes itself out, and ensuring that life continues to evolve and create beautiful new futures in the billions of years that our solar system has ahead of us. So I would actually say, let's make sure there's more intelligent life out there by maybe in one of our last opportunities in this coming century, if Kessler syndrome does kick in, let's fire off some space organisms, genetically engineer them, and seed these extremely exciting planets, but dead worlds, so far as we're aware, in our solar system.
So not colonizing actual other potential species.
Not us doing the colonizing either, I have to say. We're squishy. We don't make for good interplanetary explorers.
Alice, you go next. Intelligent life out there?
Well, like Alan, I think statistically there's got to be. There's so much space up there, so it's got to be out there somewhere. I'm probably a bit pessimistic about whether, contact will be made anytime in our lifetime, but I think the thing about this whole desire for aliens is that we really just want someone else to talk to. We want someone else to say, hey, this has been our experience of existence in the universe. What's it been like for you? And I think this is why we have pets, because we communicate with other species through our pets. And this is part of our longing just to talk to someone else and try and understand what it means even to be alive in the universe at all.
That was beautiful, Alice. Thank you. And Evie, what do you reckon?
Well, it's less beautiful than Alice. I think there is life out there. I suspect it's very boring, so I don't think it's intelligent life. I don't know. I think it's probably going to be some sort of bacteria. But I guess if I had the choice of meeting an intelligent alien or giving my cat the ability to talk to me, I would choose my cat. So again, what Alice is saying, that desire to share experience and what is existence, I think I would prefer to see more intelligent life actually evolving on this planet rather than going out and meeting an intelligent alien, but that's just me.
That was beautiful, Evie. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for being part of Just a Thought. I feel like we covered off on just like 3,000 thoughts, which is pretty great. So thank you for being part of this event from the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre.